Demonstrations in Iraq turned deadly over the weekend as protesters clashed with security forces in cities across the country. Thousands took to the streets defying a government crackdown and curfew which saw more than 70 people killed over the weekend. Protesters have rejected a number of government concessions and tax breaks offered by Prime Minister Adel Abdel Mahdi. Well, joining us now to unpack the weekend's events in Iraq is Gareth Brown. Gareth, thanks for joining us. What is driving people to go out and protest like this?
Well, this is what's so interesting about these protests, Ollie. They've turned increasingly deadly as they've gone on throughout the month. Over the weekend, we saw more than 70 people killed. That death toll is probably over 200 now since they started at the beginning of October. Now, what ignited these protests was the sacking of a senior military officer way back at the start of this month. And then protests developed. We were mainly looking at things like high unemployment. You know, Iraq is a very wealthy country. It's one of the 5th largest oil producers in the world. Yet it has a huge unemployment rate. More than 60% of people there live on less than $6 a day. So now it's turned from these kind of targeted protests against unemployment to protests against everything, absolutely everyone. You know, it's an all-out revolt, and it looks like the protesters won't really accept anything more than a full-scale resignation of the Prime Minister and of his government.
It's almost a little bit like, I mean, it's a tenuous link, but almost like the Yellow Vest protests in France. It started off as one thing and then just flared up. Now, in Iraq, the government's response has been absolutely, well, brutal. Live rounds being shot at protesters. Why are they going in with such heavy-handed tactics?
Yeah, I mean, on the face of it, the government have come down on these demonstrations with a sledgehammer. But I think it's important to unpack this violence. It's not strictly government on protester violence. We've seen a few security units, particularly ones affiliated to the Ministry of Interior, being particularly brutal towards the protesters. But, you know, in Iraq, where there's unrest, there is also opportunity. The country's rife with militias, you know, and warlords who control their own fiefdoms. And I think in this unrest, they've seen opportunities to expand, increase their influence. So, you know, the noticeable example here would be a militia called Saraya al-Salam, which is loyal to that firebrand cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, who, you know, we've got to know very well over the last 20 years or so of goings-on in Iraq. And his men, his militia, have come down on the side of the protesters. In fact, they've taken to conducting patrols in areas where they know there are going to be demonstrations, saying, you know, if the government try to clamp down, if the government are violent here towards to protesters, we are going to get involved. On the other side, you've seen other militias, noticeably Asaib al-Haq, which is a militia more closely aligned to Iranian factions, pro-Iranian factions in Baghdad. And they've been very much on the side of the government. I think they see this kind of unrest as a potential threat, not just to their influence as a militia operating within Iraq, but also Iranian influence, which they very much are the embodiment. So I guess in its essence, it is a battle that Iraqis are waging against external influence. They don't want the politicians in Baghdad to be seen as in the pocket of the US or Iran. They want Iraqi politicians working for the Iraqi people.